Welcome to Cafe Tales, Dolly Bantry's Cursed Necklace. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Edward. And isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Gossington. The late summer sun filtered through the drawing room windows of Gossington Hall, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet as Mrs. Arthur Bantry paced with characteristic energy before the fireplace. Her gray hair, always perfectly arranged despite her propensity for vigorous gestures, caught the light as she turned to face her guest with barely contained excitement. "My dear Jane," she declared, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that had served her so well in organizing countless village committees. "You simply must help me with this exhibition. The parish needs every penny we can raise, and I've had the most marvelous idea." Miss Jane Marple set down her teacup with a gentle precision that marked all her movements, and regarded her old friend with mild blue eyes that held, for those who knew how to look, a sharpness that belied her gentle exterior. She had known Dolly Bantry for more years than either cared to count, and experience had taught her that when Dolly spoke in such tones, remarkable things were bound to follow. "A charity exhibition of heirlooms," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "How very enterprising of you, Dolly." "Not just any heirlooms," Mrs. Bantry continued, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I mean to display the Gossington sapphires. They've been locked away in the bank for simply ages. And I thought, well, what's the point of having beautiful things if no one can see them? The Gossington sapphires." Miss Marple had heard whispers of them over the years, though she had never seen them herself. Legend spoke of 13 deep blue stones set in antique silver, with a distinctive clasp fashioned in the shape of a tiny black enameled forget-me-not, a mourning piece from an earlier, more sentimental age. "The curse, you mean?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Bantry waved a dismissive hand, though Miss Marple noticed a slight hesitation in the gesture. "Absolute nonsense, of course. Old wives' tales about the 13th wearer coming to grief. Superstitious rubbish, though I must admit it does make for rather intriguing conversation at tea parties." Miss Marple watched as her friend moved to the escritoire and withdrew a small velvet box from the drawer. With practiced movements, she opened it to reveal the necklace within. Even in the filtered afternoon light, the sapphires seemed to hold depths of blue fire, each stone perfectly matched to its neighbors, the silver settings showing the delicate workmanship of a bygone era. As Mrs. Bantry lifted the piece, Miss Marple observed something that would, in retrospect, prove most significant. Dolly's fingers moved with automatic precision, fastening the safety chain to her left side and arranging it in a particular graceful drape that spoke of long familiarity. When she checked the clasp, she did so by touch rather than sight, her fingers finding the small mechanism with the certainty of habit. 13 stones," Mrs. Bantry murmured, holding the necklace up to catch the light. "The central one is said to be the finest, a star sapphire with the most extraordinary depth of color." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her keen eyes noting, the tiny imperfection at what one might call 3 on the central stone, a minute chip that spoke of the necklace's age and history. Such details, she had learned over the years, often proved more illuminating than any amount of dramatic circumstance. "And who will be helping with this exhibition?" she asked. "Oh, I've assembled quite a committee," Mrs. Bantry replied with satisfaction. "Basil Pritchard from Mayfair, you know, the jeweler, has very kindly agreed to advise us and provide appraisals, all without charge for the parish. Such a distinguished man with the most impeccable reputation. She replaced the necklace carefully in its box as she continued. Then there's young Gavin Louier, a photographer who's mounting postcards and catalogs for us, quite artistic with all the latest equipment. He's even brought a portable darkroom, set it up in the morning room if you can imagine, and Lady Estelle March has expressed the most flattering interest. Claims there's some family connection to the Sapphires, though I can't quite place it. Myself. Miss Marple filed away each name as Mrs. Bantry spoke, her mind already beginning to catalog the various personalities that would surround the exhibition. In her experience, when valuable objects and diverse personalities came together, the results were rarely as simple as one might hope. Mr. Warborough has been invaluable with the insurance arrangements, Mrs. Bantry continued. So discreet and thorough as always, and naturally the Reverend and Mrs. Clement are involved. It is for the parish, after all. Dr. Haddock has promised to look in, and Inspector Slack has even agreed to advise on security matters. Quite a gathering, Miss Marple observed. And when is this exhibition to take place? Tomorrow afternoon? For the preview, then open to the public the following day. Everything's arranged. Glass cases, proper lighting, even printed programs. It should be quite the success. Mrs. Bantry's voice carried a note of pride that was entirely justifiable. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out across the familiar grounds of Gossington Hall towards the village beyond. The late summer afternoon was drawing to a close, and already she could see the first hints of evening mist beginning to gather in the hollows between the trees. "I should be delighted to help," she said quietly. "Though I confess, Dolly, that something about this whole arrangement makes me feel rather watchful." Mrs. Bantry laughed, the sound echoing warmly through the drawing room. "My dear Jane, you always were one for sensing drama where none exists. What could possibly go wrong with a simple charity exhibition?" Miss Marple turned from the window, her mild blue eyes thoughtful. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that when people insisted nothing could go wrong, it was precisely the moment when everything began to do so. "I'm sure you're quite right," she said gently. "Shall I come early tomorrow to help with the final arrangements?" "Perfect," Mrs. Bantry declared. "Though do try not to look for mysteries where none exist, Jane. Sometimes a charitable exhibition is simply that, a charitable exhibition." As Miss Marple gathered her things to leave, she found her gaze drawn once more to the velvet box containing the sapphires. 13 stones and a story of misfortune. In her experience, when legends and valuable objects combined, the results were rarely confined to the realm of superstition. But she said nothing more, merely smiled and promised to return early the following morning. After all, what could possibly happen at a simple village charity exhibition? Time, as it had a way of doing, would provide the answer to that question far sooner than anyone might have wished. Chapter 2. A Curse in the Catalogue. Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall the following morning to find the household in a state of considerable agitation. Mrs. Bantry met her at the front door, 2 folded sheets of paper clutched in her hand, and an expression of mixed indignation and unease upon her face. "Jane, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed without preamble. "The most extraordinary thing has happened. Look at these." Miss Marple accepted the papers and unfolded them with care. Both were typed on ordinary white notepaper, the sort that might be purchased at any stationer's shop in the county. The messages were brief and to the point, yet somehow all the more unsettling for their stark simplicity. The first read, "Do not exhibit. The 13th brings mourning. The second, return them to those wronged. When did these arrive? Miss Marple asked, examining the papers more closely in the morning light. With the first post, Mrs. Bantry replied, leading the way into the morning room where the final preparations for the exhibition were taking place. Slipped under the front door, actually. No envelope, no stamp, nothing to indicate where they came from. The morning room had been transformed since Miss Marple's last visit. Glass display cases had been arranged around the perimeter, their contents gleaming softly under specially arranged lighting. In one corner, young Mr. Luier had established what appeared to be a miniature photographer's studio, complete with cameras, tripods, and various pieces of equipment that Miss Marple could not readily identify. "Ah, Miss Marple," came a cultured voice from across the room. "How delightful to meet you at last." Miss Marple turned to see a distinguished gentleman approaching, his bearing erect and his manner suggesting the confidence that came from years of handling valuable objects. This, she deduced, must be Mr. Basil Pritchard, the Mayfair jeweler. "Mr. Pritchard has been examining the anonymous notes," Mrs. Bantry explained, her voice carrying a note of concern she was attempting to disguise. "He believes they might be connected to our exhibition." "Indeed," Mr. Pritchard said gravely, accepting the papers from Miss Marple and holding them up to the light. "Most disturbing, though I must say, the typing suggests they were composed on a machine with certain distinctive characteristics." As if summoned by the mention of typing, Mr. Gavin Luier looked up from his work at a small table where he'd been preparing display cards. He was a young man of perhaps 30, with a quick, nervous energy that Miss Marple had observed often accompanied artistic temperaments. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, with a laugh that struck Miss Marple as perhaps a shade too hearty. "Terribly sorry, but I've been using my Remington to type the labels and catalog cards. The E key has a bit of a chip in it, I'm afraid. Leaves rather a distinctive mark." Miss Marple moved closer to examine the typewriter, noting indeed that the letter E produced a faint nicked impression quite different from the other characters. She looked again at the anonymous notes in Mr. Pritchard's hands and observed that they too showed the same peculiar faintness in their E characters. "How very interesting," she murmured. Mr. Luier's laugh became more natural. "Oh, I say, you're not suggesting I wrote those dreadful warnings, are you? I assure you the only thing I'm interested in cursing is poor lighting conditions and blurred photographs. Rather good publicity for the exhibition, though, wouldn't you say? Nothing like a touch of mystery to draw the crowds." Mr. Pritchard's expression remained serious. "I'm afraid I cannot view this matter quite so lightly, Mr. Luier. Mrs. Bantry is displaying items of considerable value, and security must be our paramount concern." He turned to address Mrs. Bantry directly. "I have taken the liberty of bringing a specially designed glass case for the sapphires, reinforced corners with precision screws, and a custom velvet cradle to protect the antique settings. I insist upon providing it at no charge, naturally." Miss Marple watched as the jeweler produced an elegant glass case from a nearby packing crate. The construction was indeed impressive, with brass corner fittings and screws that gleamed with recent polishing. As Mr. Pritchard demonstrated the mechanism, she noticed that 2 of the corner screws showed fresh burring around their heads, while the other 2 remained untouched, a curious diagonal pattern that she filed away in her memory. "How very generous of you, Mr. Pritchard," Mrs. Bantry said, though her voice still carried traces of the morning's upset. "Though I must say all this talk of curses and warnings does make one feel rather unsettled." "Nonsense, my dear Dolly," came a new voice from the doorway. Lady Estelle March entered with a sort of graceful assurance that spoke of generations of breeding and social confidence. She was a woman of middle years, impeccably dressed, with the kind of understated elegance that suggested wealth worn so naturally as to be almost invisible. Surely you don't mean to let a couple of silly notes spoil what promises to be a perfectly delightful exhibition. Miss Marple studied the newcomer with interest. Lady Estelle's gloves were of the finest white kid, extending well past her wrists in the continental fashion, and she moved with the careful grace of one accustomed to being observed and admired. Lady Estelle has been most helpful with the historical research, Mrs. Bantry explained. She believes there may be some connection between her family and the original owners of the sapphires. Indeed, Lady Estelle replied, moving to examine the display cases. These old pieces often have such fascinating provenance. One simply never knows what stories they might tell, if only stones could speak. Mr. Louier had returned to his typing, the machine's keys clicking in a steady rhythm punctuated by the distinctive soft sound of the damaged E. Miss Marple found herself listening to the pattern, noting how the flaw in the key created a subtle but unmistakable signature in everything he produced. The important thing, Mr. Pritchard was saying, is that we maintain proper security protocols. I suggest the case remain locked at all times when not under direct supervision, and that we limit the number of people who have access to the keys. Splendid. Footfall, though, Mrs. Bantry murmured almost to herself. All this talk of curses, it really will draw the crowds, won't it? Miss Marple detected a note in her friend's voice that suggested Dolly was perhaps not entirely displeased by the mysterious nature of the morning's events. A charity exhibition with a touch of supernatural intrigue would indeed prove more compelling than a simple display of family heirlooms. Mrs. Bantry, she said gently, might I suggest that we proceed with extra caution? In my experience, when people go to the trouble of composing anonymous warnings, they usually have some specific purpose in mind. Oh, Jane, surely you're not taking this seriously, Mrs. Bantry protested. They're probably just some village busybody trying to create excitement. But even as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Bantry's fingers had moved unconsciously to her throat, as if already feeling the weight of the sapphires she would soon be wearing for the preview. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke of deeper unease than her words suggested. The morning proceeded with the final arrangements, each person absorbed in their particular responsibilities. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath the surface civility, Mr. Pritchard's careful attention to security details, Mr. Louier's nervous energy as he worked at his typewriter, Lady Estelle's keen interest in the historical aspects of the collection. Each element seemed perfectly reasonable in isolation, yet together they created a pattern that left her feeling distinctly watchful. As the morning drew to a close and the various participants began to disperse for lunch, Miss Marple remained behind for a moment, studying the glass case that would soon hold the Gossington sapphires. The fresh burring on those diagonal screws continued to puzzle her, and she made a mental note to observe how the case was handled during the afternoon's preview. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that when people took pains to warn of curses and misfortune, they were often preparing to ensure that such predictions came true. Chapter 3. Blue Fire Under the Lamp. The afternoon. Preview commenced at precisely 3 hours, with the drawing room and morning room of Gossington Hall transformed into elegant galleries that would have done credit to any London establishment. Miss Marple positioned herself near the entrance, ostensibly to assist with welcoming guests, but in reality to observe the various interactions that were certain to unfold. The Gossington sapphires had been arranged in Mr. Pritchard's special case as the centerpiece of the exhibition, their deep blue stones catching the afternoon light with an almost hypnotic brilliance. A small crowd had already gathered around the display, murmuring appreciatively at the necklace's undeniable beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Pritchard announced, his voice carrying the authority of professional expertise. "If I might have your attention for a moment, I should like to demonstrate something rather special about these remarkable stones." From a leather case, he withdrew what appeared to be a small lamp with an unusual blue-tinted bulb. Miss Marple watched with growing interest as he connected the device to a nearby electrical outlet and gestured for someone to dim the overhead lighting. "This is what we call an actinic lamp," he explained to the assembled guests. "It produces a particular spectrum of light that reveals the true fire within genuine sapphires, something that paste or glass simply cannot replicate." As the room darkened, Mr. Pritchard switched on his lamp and directed its strange blue radiance toward the necklace. The effect was immediate and quite spectacular. Each sapphire seemed to ignite from within, displaying depths of color and brilliance that had been merely hinted at under ordinary illumination. Gasps of admiration rippled through the small audience. For precisely 3 minutes, the lamp played across the stones, while Mr. Pritchard provided a learned commentary on the geological properties that created such magnificent effects. Miss Marple found herself studying not only the dazzling display, but also the faces of those watching it. Mrs. Bantry's expression showed genuine pride mixed with something that might have been relief. Lady Estelle appeared entranced, her gloved hands clasped before her in obvious appreciation. Mr. Louier moved about the periphery with his camera, capturing the demonstration from various angles. When the overhead lights were restored and the white actinic lamp switched off, the sapphires settled back into their more subdued but still remarkable beauty. Mr. Pritchard carefully placed his lamp back in its case, which Miss Marple noticed had a curious double-bottom construction with what appeared to be a hidden latch mechanism. "Magnificent," Lady Estelle breathed. "One can quite understand how such stones might inspire legends and superstitions." Mrs. Bantry moved forward to secure the glass case, her movement showing the same habitual precision Miss Marple had observed the previous day. Yet, as Dolly arranged the necklace in its velvet cradle, Lady Estelle frowned slightly. "How curious," she murmured. "The clasp appears to be facing the wrong direction." "Wrong direction?" Mrs. Bantry paused, her fingers hovering over the arrangement. "But I always place it left-facing. It's simply the way I've always done it." "Perhaps the blue light distorted our perception," Mr. Pritchard suggested diplomatically. "These old pieces can be quite particular about how they settle in their settings." Miss Marple stepped closer, ostensibly to admire the display, but actually to observe the details of the arrangement. In the velvet cradle, she noted that the indent beneath the central stone seemed somewhat shallow compared to what one might expect from the weight and size of the sapphire. It was a subtle observation, but one that added to her growing collection of small inconsistencies. As the guests dispersed to examine other displays, Mr. Louier approached Mrs. Bantry with obvious excitement. "Mrs. Bantry, if I might suggest, the lighting conditions were absolutely perfect during Mr. Pritchard's demonstration. Would it be possible to arrange a few additional photographs? Perhaps some close-up studies of individual stones?" "Certainly," Mrs. Bantry replied graciously. "Though I do hope you'll be careful with the case. These old mechanisms can be rather temperamental." Miss Marple watched as Mr. Louier set up his equipment for what appeared to be a more detailed photographic session. His movements were quick and efficient, suggesting considerable experience with such work. Yet she noticed that when he adjusted his camera's position, small particles of blue-tinted lint seemed to cling to the felt lining of Mr. Pritchard's lamp case, which remained open nearby. The afternoon proceeded smoothly, with guests moving between the various displays and expressing appropriate admiration for the assembled treasures. Dr. Haddock arrived with his usual blend of professional curiosity and skeptical humor, while the Reverend and Mrs. Clement maintained their customary air of gentle supervision over parish affairs. Inspector Slack appeared shortly after 4 died, his presence more reassuring than intrusive, as he made a quiet circuit of the rooms, checking sight lines and access points with the thoroughness of long experience. Miss Marple was pleased to note that he paused for some time at the sapphire display. His attention focused on the security arrangements with obvious approval. "Excellent work, Mr. Pritchard," he commented. "That case should deter all but the most determined thieves." "One can never be too careful," the jeweler replied. "Though, I must confess, the anonymous warnings this morning have left me somewhat unsettled. Perhaps we should consider additional precautions for this evening." "Anonymous warnings?" Inspector Slack's interest sharpened immediately. "What sort of warnings?" Mrs. Bantry reluctantly produced the morning's messages, which Inspector Slack examined with professional attention. Miss Marple watched his face as he read, noting the particular care with which he studied the typescript. He murmured. "Someone with access to a typewriter and strong opinions about this exhibition. The question is whether they represent a genuine threat or merely someone's idea of a dramatic gesture." "Mr. Luier has been typing catalog cards," Mrs. Bantry offered. "His machine has a distinctive fault in the E key." Inspector Slack's gaze found the young photographer, who was still absorbed in his work with a camera. "I see. Well, I'll want to have a word with everyone involved before the public opening tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest we maintain extra vigilance." As the preview drew to a close and the last guest departed, Miss Marple remained to assist with the final arrangements. She observed Mrs. Bantry's careful ritual of checking each display case, noting particularly how her friend's fingers confirmed the security of the sapphire case's lock through practiced touch rather than sight. "A successful afternoon," Mrs. Bantry declared with satisfaction. "Though I must admit, all this talk of curses and warnings has left me feeling rather on edge." "Perhaps that was the intention," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Sometimes the purpose of creating unease is to make people less observant of other more practical concerns." As they prepared to leave the transformed rooms, Miss Marple took one final look at the sapphire display. In the settling evening light, the stones seemed to hold mysteries beyond their geological composition. The shallow indent in the velvet cradle, the blue lint on Mr. Pritchard's lamp case, the precise arrangement that somehow seemed different from Mrs. Bantry's usual method. Each detail whispered of complications yet to come. "Dolly," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might consider having the case checked once more before tomorrow's public opening. Sometimes the most careful arrangements can benefit from a final review." "Whatever for, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. "Oh, I'm sure it is," Miss Marple replied. "It's simply that, in my experience, when people take pains to create beautiful displays, they sometimes overlook the small details that matter most." As they walked toward the front door, neither woman noticed the brief flicker of the electric lights, a momentary interruption so subtle as to be easily dismissed as a minor fluctuation in the household current. Yet in the morning room behind them, that innocent flicker would prove to be the first move in a game whose rules were known to only one player. Chapter 4. The Clasp That Faced the Wrong Way. Evening had settled over Gossington Hall with a particular quietness that comes to grand houses, when the day's activities have ended and the night's mysteries are yet to begin. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage for a simple dinner, but found herself strangely restless, her thoughts returning repeatedly to the afternoon's events, and the small inconsistencies that had caught her attention. It was nearly 8 when the telephone rang with Mrs. Bantry's voice, pitched higher than usual with barely controlled agitation. "Jane, you must come at once. Something has happened. Something quite dreadful, though I'm not entirely certain what it means." Within 20 minutes, Miss Marple had made her way back to Gossington Hall, where she found the household in a state of considerable confusion. The cause, it seemed, had been a brief electrical failure that had plunged the morning room into darkness for perhaps 2 minutes. "It was the kettle in the kitchen," Mrs. Bantry explained, as she led Miss Marple toward the exhibition rooms. "Tilda was preparing tea for those of us staying late, and somehow the circuit became overloaded. Nothing serious, mind you. The lights came back on almost immediately." They entered the morning room to find several people clustered around the sapphire display. Mr. Pritchard stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his professional composure intact, but his eyes showing signs of strain. Tilda Briggs hovered nearby, wringing her hands in obvious distress, while Lady Estelle examined her reflection in a small hand mirror, apparently checking that her appearance had suffered no ill effects from the brief excitement. "What exactly occurred?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "When the lights returned," Mrs. Bantry began, then paused as if uncertain how to continue. "Well, Tilda lifted the cover from the display case to ensure everything was in order, and she noticed, that is to say, she thought she noticed, the necklace looked different." "The necklace looked different," Miss Tilda interrupted, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Not wrong exactly, but not quite right either, as if someone had been at it during the darkness." Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat diplomatically. "I have examined the piece thoroughly, and I can assure everyone that the necklace itself is entirely intact and properly secured. The case shows no signs of tampering, and the lock remains perfectly sound." Miss Marple approached the display case and studied its contents carefully. The sapphires lay in their velvet cradle exactly as they had been arranged after the afternoon's demonstration, their deep blue depths catching the restored electric light with undiminished brilliance. Yet something indefinable seemed different, a subtle alteration that nagged at the edges of perception without revealing itself clearly. "Mrs. Bantry," she said quietly, "would you mind handling the necklace, just to reassure yourself that all is well?" Mrs. Bantry moved forward with obvious reluctance, her usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic hesitancy. She unlocked the case with a key she wore on a chain at her waist and lifted the necklace with the careful reverence due such a valuable piece. It was then that Miss Marple saw what had been troubling them all. Mrs. Bantry's fingers, moving with the automatic precision of long habit, faltered as they encountered the safety chain. Instead of draping to the left, as it invariably did when she handled the piece, the chain fell naturally to the right, a mirror image of her usual arrangement. "How very curious," Mrs. Bantry murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels different." Miss Marple leaned closer, her sharp eyes examining the clasp mechanism with minute attention. There, barely visible against the black enamel of the tiny forget-me-not, was a bright new scratch, a thin line of exposed metal that caught the light like a silver thread. "The clasp has been opened recently," she observed. "See how the tongue shows a fresh mark where it was engaged? Your own method of fastening, Dolly, would never create such a scratch in that particular position." The implications of this discovery settled over the group like a cold draft. If the necklace had indeed been disturbed during the brief failure, it suggested a level of preparation and audacity that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. "Impossible," Mr. Pritchard declared, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The case was locked, and the room was never left unattended. Even during the electrical failure, We were all present. But it was quite dark, Lady Estelle pointed out reasonably. One could hardly see one's hand before one's face, and with everyone concerned about the lights, attention might have been elsewhere. Inspector Slack arrived within minutes of being summoned, his presence lending an official gravity to what had begun as a simple power failure. He examined the case with professional thoroughness, paying particular attention to the lock mechanism and the arrangement of the contents. "The lock shows no signs of forcing," he announced. "Whoever did this, if indeed anything was done, had access to a key or possessed considerable skill with lock mechanisms." Miss Marple requested that the case be closed and secured for the remainder of the evening, a suggestion that met with immediate agreement from all present. As Inspector Slack made arrangements for additional security overnight, she found herself studying the faces of those who'd been present during the power failure. Mr. Pritchard maintained his professional composure, though she noticed that his hands showed the slight tremor that sometimes accompanies controlled anxiety. Lady Estelle had regained her usual poise, but there was something in her manner, a heightened alertness, that suggested her thoughts were moving along private channels. Even young Mr. Luier, who had arrived during the confusion, seemed affected by the atmosphere of suspicion that had settled over the gathering. "Mr. Luier," Mrs. Bantry said suddenly, "didn't you ask me to step into your dark room this evening? Something about approving a postcard proof?" The photographer looked up from his equipment with apparent surprise. "Did I? Oh, yes, of course. The lighting studies from this afternoon, though with all this excitement, perhaps we might postpone that until tomorrow." "I think that would be wise," Inspector Slack interjected. "Until we determine exactly what occurred here this evening, I prefer that access to these rooms be strictly limited." As the various participants began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered for a moment beside the sealed display case. The sapphires lay in their enforced security, their beauty unchanged, but their innocence somehow compromised by the evening's events. The fresh scratch on the clasp mechanism seemed to wink at her in the electric light, a tiny signature left by whoever had dared to handle the necklace during those crucial minutes of darkness. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said quietly, approaching with obvious reluctance, "what do you think really happened here tonight?" Miss Marple turned to regard her old friend with gentle sympathy. "I think, my dear Dolly, that someone has been very clever indeed. The question is whether their cleverness extends to understanding the consequences of their actions." As they prepared to leave the morning room, Miss Marple took one final look at the display case that had become the center of so much attention. The anonymous warnings of the morning, the afternoon's elaborate demonstration, and now this evening's mysterious disturbance. Each event seemed designed to focus attention on the sapphires, while simultaneously creating opportunities for unknown purposes. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that when people went to such elaborate lengths to create confusion, it was usually because they had something very specific they wished to accomplish under cover of that confusion. The question now was whether they had succeeded in their purpose, or whether the evening's events were merely preparation for something more significant yet to come. Chapter 5. Paste, Provenance, and a Photograph. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Gossington Hall with deceptive cheerfulness, casting golden squares across the Persian carpet as Miss Marple arrived to find the household already astir with nervous energy. Mrs. Bantry met her at the door with an expression that managed to combine relief at her friend's arrival with barely concealed anxiety about what the day might bring. "Jane, thank heavens you're here early," she said, leading the way toward the morning room. "Mr. Pritchard has made the most disturbing discovery." They found the jeweler standing before the sealed display case, his usual professional composure notably absent. His hands, Miss Marple observed, showed signs of having been clenched and unclenched repeatedly, and there was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "Mrs. Bantry," he began without preamble, "I must confess that something has been troubling me since last evening's incident. I took the liberty of conducting a more thorough examination of the necklace this morning, and I'm afraid my findings are most concerning." Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe not only Mr. Pritchard but also the reactions of the others present. Mr. Warborough, the solicitor, had arrived early and stood with his briefcase clutched protectively against his chest, his usually composed features showing distinct signs of strain. "What sort of concerns?" Mrs. Bantry asked, though her voice suggested she dreaded the answer. Mr. Pritchard gestured toward the sealed case. "The settings behind 3 of the stones, the central sapphire and its immediate neighbors, show evidence of modern foil backing rather than the open-backed construction typical of the Georgian period. Such backing is characteristic of paste copies," Mr. Warborough finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's impossible. The insurance valuation was based on the originals." At that moment, young Mr. Luyer entered the room carrying what appeared to be a freshly developed photograph. His manner was excited, though Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of something else. Perhaps satisfaction at having solved a puzzle, or possibly nervousness at having to deliver unwelcome news. "I say," he announced, "I've just finished processing yesterday's photographs from the actinic lamp demonstration, and there's something rather extraordinary that I think you should see." He held up a large print that showed the sapphire necklace in remarkable detail during the blue light examination. Even to Miss Marple's untrained eye, the quality of the photography was exceptional, capturing nuances of color and texture that revealed the true artistry of the piece. "Look here," Mr. Luyer continued, pointing to the central stone with the tip of his pencil. "At precisely 3 quarts on the main sapphire. Do you see that tiny chip? It shows quite clearly in the photograph." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward to examine the image, her face growing pale as she recognized the familiar flaw. "Yes, that's always been there, a tiny imperfection that makes the stone unmistakably identifiable." "Precisely," Mr. Luyer said, with growing excitement. "But when I examined the necklace in the case this morning, well, see for yourself." With Mr. Warborough producing the keys with obvious reluctance, they opened the display case and lifted the necklace into better light. Mrs. Bantry's gasp was audible as she examined the central stone through the jeweler's magnifying glass. "The chip isn't there," she whispered. "How can it simply have disappeared?" The implications of this discovery settled over the group like a funeral pall. If the distinctive chip that had marked the central sapphire for generations was no longer present, it could mean only one thing. The necklace currently in their possession was not the original. Inspector Slack arrived within minutes of being summoned, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. Miss Marple watched with interest as he immediately focused on the security arrangements, examining the case with the methodical thoroughness she had come to associate with his professional approach. "The lock shows no signs of tampering," he announced, confirming Mr. Pritchard's earlier assessment. "But someone with considerable skill could have opened this without leaving obvious traces." Miss Marple approached the glass case and ran her finger along the brass corner fittings, paying particular attention to the screws that secured the reinforced corners. Under the heads of 2 diagonal screws, she found tiny slivers of fresh brass, swarf, metal filings that suggested recent disturbance. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe someone lifted this glass pane by removing only 2 corner screws, just enough to create a gap that would allow access to the interior." "Inspector." Slack examined the evidence with growing interest. "Ingenious," he admitted. Remove 2 diagonal corners, slide a hand inside during the blackout, make the substitution, and replace the screws afterward. The lock would remain intact, and casual observation would reveal nothing amiss. But how could anyone have been prepared for such an opportunity? Mr. Warborough asked plaintively. The power failure was surely accidental. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of those present, noting the various expressions of shock, concern, and calculation that flickered across their features. It was Mr. Luier who broke the uncomfortable silence. Actually, he said with obvious reluctance, I'm not entirely certain the power failure was accidental. I noticed someone near the fuse box in the kitchen passage just before the lights went out, though I couldn't see clearly who it was in the dim light. This revelation added another layer of complexity to what was already a most perplexing situation. If the power failure had been deliberately orchestrated, it suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the entire affair from opportunistic theft to carefully planned crime. Lady Estelle arrived during these discussions, her usual poise, intact despite the early hour. She listened to the developments with apparent fascination, though Miss Marple noticed that her gloved hands remained perfectly steady, an observation that struck her as somehow significant. How perfectly dreadful, Lady Estelle murmured. To think that such a carefully planned substitution could be carried out under our very noses. The thief must possess considerable knowledge of both jewelry and security procedures. Mr. Pritchard's response was immediate and defensive. I can assure you, Lady Estelle, that my security arrangements were entirely adequate. This crime required inside knowledge and careful preparation. It was not the work of a casual opportunist. As Inspector Slack began the process of sealing the room and organizing interviews with all who had been present during the previous evening's events, Miss Marple found herself returning repeatedly to certain small details that nagged at her consciousness: the diagonal pattern of the disturbed screws, the precise timing of the power failure, and most particularly the quality of the paste copies that had replaced the originals. Mr. Pritchard, she said thoughtfully, in your professional opinion, how long would it take to create paste copies of sufficient quality to fool casual observation? The jeweler considered the question carefully. For work of this caliber, several weeks at minimum. The molds alone would require considerable time and skill to prepare properly. The implication was clear. Whoever had perpetrated this substitution had been planning it for far longer than the few days since the exhibition had been announced. This was not a crime of opportunity, but rather the culmination of an extended and carefully orchestrated campaign. As the morning progressed and Inspector Slack began his methodical interviews, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the various participants. In her long experience, the moments immediately following the discovery of a crime often revealed more about the perpetrators than hours of subsequent investigation. What she saw confirmed her growing suspicion that the theft of the Gossington sapphires was merely one movement in a more complex composition, a composition whose final notes had yet to be played. Chapter 6. A Velvet Case with Two Impressions. Miss Marple had learned over the years that the most revealing evidence often lay not in dramatic discoveries, but in the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details that others might overlook. It was with this principle in mind that she requested permission to examine Mr. Pritchard's velvet cradle more closely. Certainly, Miss Marple, the jeweler agreed, though his voice carried a note of puzzlement. Though I'm not sure what you hope to find. The cradle is simply a protective device I designed specifically for the exhibition. With Inspector Slack's permission, the glass case was once again opened, and the paste necklace carefully removed. Miss Marple accepted the velvet cradle with gentle hands, turning it slowly in the morning light that streamed through the tall windows of Gossington Hall. What she discovered was precisely what her instincts had suggested she might find. The deep blue velvet lining bore not one but two distinct sets of impressions, evidence of two different objects having rested there at various times. "How very interesting," she murmured, tracing the outlines with her fingertip. "The deeper impression here is older and more pronounced, suggesting the weight of the original necklace over time. But this shallower marking—" She paused, studying the second set of indentations. This would be consistent with a lighter replica. Mr. Pritchard leaned forward with professional interest, his trained eye immediately grasping the significance of Miss Marple's observation. "You're absolutely right. The depth differential would indicate a substantial weight variation between the two pieces." Inspector Slack made careful notes as Miss Marple continued her examination. In the hinge crease of the velvet cradle, where the fabric folded upon itself, she discovered a tiny grain of what appeared to be coal dust. A black particle so small as to be nearly invisible, yet distinctive enough to suggest its origin. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe this coal dust may have come from Mr. Lewier's darkroom. I noticed yesterday that he has a small stove in there for temperature control during the photographic process." The implications were becoming increasingly clear. The evidence suggested that the velvet cradle had spent time in the darkroom, where the substitution had likely been prepared well in advance of the actual theft. As Miss Marple continued her examination, she made another discovery that proved equally significant. Along the safety chain attachment point of the paste necklace, barely visible to the naked eye, was a faint violet stain, a color that seemed oddly familiar. "Mr. Lewier," she said, addressing the young photographer directly, "Might I see your hands for a moment?" The request clearly startled him, but he extended his hands with what appeared to be willingness to cooperate. Miss Marple examined his fingers with the sort of attention she might have devoted to a particularly interesting botanical specimen. "Methyl. Violet," she observed calmly. "Used in the photographic process for marking contact prints, I believe. It has a tendency to stain the fingertips of those who work with it regularly." Mr. Lewier glanced down at his hands with apparent surprise. "Yes, I suppose it does. Occupational hazard, I'm afraid, though I fail to see how that connects to—" He was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the darkroom. Inspector Slack, who had dispatched a constable to begin searching the various rooms, returned with an expression of grim concern. "I'm afraid we have another problem," he announced. "The darkroom door is locked from the inside, and Mr. Lewier's assistant isn't responding to our calls." The group moved quickly toward the morning room where the photographer had established his temporary studio. Inspector Slack knocked firmly on the darkroom door, calling out in his official voice. When no response came, he made the decision to force entry. What they found beyond the door would haunt Miss Marple's memory for years to come. Young Gavin Lewier lay motionless on the floor of the small room, a length of black velvet ribbon wound tightly around his throat. The same ribbon, Miss Marple realized with a chill, that had been used to secure the necklace case. The Remington typewriter sat on a small table, its keys gleaming dully in the red-tinted light that filtered through the darkroom's special windows. The distinctive E-key bore its familiar chip, and scattered papers nearby showed the telltale marks of that damaged character. Most significantly, hanging from a hook on the wall, was Mr. Pritchard's lamp case, the very case that the jeweler had sworn he left in the exhibition room the previous evening. Inspector Slack immediately took charge of the scene, sending for the police surgeon while ensuring that no one disturbed the evidence. Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement of objects in the cramped space, noting details that would prove crucial to understanding the sequence of events. The key, she observed quietly to Inspector Slack, was turned from outside and then pushed back under the door. See the traces of grease pencil and coal dust on the metal? Someone wanted it to appear that Mr. Luyer had locked himself in. The inspector examined the evidence with growing appreciation for Miss Marple's observational skills. "You're suggesting he was murdered, and the scene arranged to look like something else." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that whoever did this wanted to ensure that Mr. Luyer would not be available to answer questions about his role in recent events." Dr. Haddock arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand, and his expression suitably grave for the circumstances. His examination was thorough but brief, confirming what was already apparent to those present. "Death by strangulation," he announced. The ribbon was applied with considerable force, suggesting either great strength or great desperation on the part of the assailant. As the investigation expanded to encompass this far more serious crime, Miss Marple found herself considering the various connections between the theft and the murder. The evidence suggested that Mr. Luyer had discovered something about the necklace, substitution, perhaps through his photographic work, that had made him dangerous to the real perpetrator. Mrs. Bantry, who had been remarkably composed during the discovery of the theft, seemed genuinely shaken by the young photographer's death. "But who would do such a thing?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "He seemed such a harmless young man, so enthusiastic about his work." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "his enthusiasm led him to notice things that others preferred to keep hidden." The investigation now took on a much more serious character, with Inspector Slack coordinating between the theft and the murder, while attempting to establish a timeline that would account for both crimes. The discovery of Mr. Pritchard's lamp case in the dark room raised immediate questions about the jeweler's movements during the crucial evening hours. "I have no idea how that case came to be there," Mr. Pritchard insisted, his professional composure finally beginning to crack under the strain. "I distinctly remember leaving it in the exhibition room after the demonstration." Miss Marple studied the man's face carefully, noting the genuine confusion that seemed to underlie his protestations. In her experience, such confusion was often the mark of someone who had told the truth so often that they had begun to believe their own fabrications. As the morning progressed and the various threads of evidence began to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that the solution to both crimes lay not in the dramatic gestures that had captured everyone's attention, but in the small human details that revealed the true character of those involved. The velvet case with its two impressions, the violet stain on the safety chain, the coal dust in the cradle's crease. Each element pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan that had gone tragically wrong when one participant proved more observant than the others had anticipated. Chapter 7. The Anonymous Notes with He and Asht, a chipped E. The discovery of Mr. Luyer's body had transformed what had begun as a genteel village charity exhibition into something far more sinister. Inspector Slack established his headquarters in the library of Gossington Hall, from where he could coordinate the investigation while maintaining easy access to both the scene of the theft and the site of the murder. Miss Marple positioned herself in a corner chair where she could observe the proceedings without interfering, her knitting providing the perfect excuse for her continued presence. She had learned over the years that people often revealed more when they believed themselves to be unobserved by anyone of consequence. Inspector Slack's initial theory, which he outlined to the assembled suspects with characteristic directness, was that Mr. Luyer had been both the author of the anonymous warnings and the perpetrator of the necklace theft. According to this interpretation, the young photographer had used his access to the typewriter and his knowledge of the exhibition layout to plan and execute the substitution, only to be murdered by an accomplice who sought to eliminate him and claim the entire prize. The evidence seems clear enough, Inspector Slack declared, consulting his notebook. Luyer had access to the typewriter that produced the warning notes. His darkroom provided the perfect location for preparing the paste copies and planning the substitution. The coal dust and photographic chemicals found in the velvet cradle confirm his involvement. Mr. Warborough, who had grown increasingly pale throughout the morning's revelations, cleared his throat nervously. Inspector, if I might mention, the insurance policy was discreetly increased just yesterday at Mr. Pritchard's suggestion. The additional coverage would apply to any loss occurring during the exhibition period. This revelation cast a new light on the proceedings, suggesting that the theft might have been motivated not merely by the value of the sapphires themselves, but by the potential insurance settlement. Miss Marple noted with interest how each person present reacted to this information. Mr. Pritchard's response was immediate and indignant. I recommended the additional coverage purely as a precautionary measure, given the value of the pieces being displayed. It seemed only prudent to ensure adequate protection. Lady Estelle, who had maintained her composed elegance throughout the morning's dramas, offered a different perspective. Surely, she said in her cultured voice, young artists are often impulsive creatures. Perhaps Mr. Luyer saw an opportunity for what he considered a harmless prank, never intending any real theft. Miss Marple found this suggestion particularly interesting, noting how quickly Lady Estelle had moved to characterize the crime as the work of an impulsive artist rather than a calculated criminal. Such swift interpretation often revealed as much about the speaker as about the situation being discussed. There's something else, Inspector Slack continued, producing the anonymous warning notes from his evidence file. We found additional examples of the same distinctive typing in Luyer's darkroom, draft versions with corrections and revisions. It's clear he composed these warnings himself, presumably to create an atmosphere of mystery that would enhance the exhibition's appeal. Mrs. Bantry, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during these discussions, finally spoke. But that seemed so unlike him. He was enthusiastic about the exhibition, certainly, but he struck me as genuinely dedicated to his craft rather than given to theatrical gestures. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with apparent casualness. The question that interests me, she said mildly, is why someone who had gone to such trouble to create mysterious warnings would then proceed to steal the very object he was supposedly trying to protect. This observation hung in the air for a moment, its implications gradually becoming clear to those present. If Mr. Luyer had indeed authored the warnings, his motive seemed inconsistent with subsequently committing the theft those warnings had predicted. Inspector Slack frowned, clearly considering this contradiction. Perhaps the warnings were meant to deflect suspicion from himself, to create the impression that some external threat existed while he prepared to carry out the actual crime. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed gently. Though in my experience, when people take pains to establish their innocence in advance, they rarely proceed to commit the very crimes they've warned against. Tilda Briggs, who had been hovering anxiously throughout the proceedings, suddenly burst into tears. It's all my fault, she sobbed. I should never have left my post, not even for a moment. But when the lights went out, I was so frightened and everyone was moving about in the darkness. Inspector Slack questioned her carefully about her movements during the crucial period, but her account seemed to confirm what others had already stated. The power failure had created sufficient confusion to allow someone with prepared equipment and detailed knowledge to execute the substitution quickly and efficiently. Miss Marple had been studying the various personalities involved with increasing attention to their individual habits and characteristics. She requested permission to observe each person's method of tying knots, a suggestion that was met with some bewilderment, but eventually accepted. Mrs. Bantry, when asked to secure a display cord, tied neat bows with practiced efficiency. Mr. Warborough produced precise, flat square knots that spoke of military training or nautical experience. Most interesting of all, Mr. Pritchard demonstrated a jeweler's half-hitch, a specialized knot designed to secure valuable items during transport. "How fascinating," Miss Marple observed, watching Mr. Pritchard's fingers work with automatic precision. "Such knots require considerable practice to execute properly." Lady Estelle, when her turn came, removed her gloves with reluctance and tied a simple overhand knot. Miss Marple noted that the gloves, which were of the finest white kid leather extending well past her wrists, showed a tiny tear near the right thumb that had been invisibly mended with silk thread of a slightly different shade. "Gloves of such quality must be quite expensive to replace," Miss Marple commented with apparent innocence. "Indeed," Lady Estelle replied, her voice carrying the slightest edge of defensiveness. "One learns to care for fine things properly, as—" The afternoon wore on, and Inspector Slack continued his methodical investigation. Miss Marple found herself increasingly focused on the timing of events. The anonymous warnings had appeared before anyone except those closely involved could have known about the exhibition's details. The paste copies must have been prepared weeks in advance, requiring not only skill but detailed knowledge of the original pieces. Most significantly, the murder of Mr. Luier suggested that he had discovered something that threatened the real perpetrator's plans. His photographic work, with its attention to minute details, would have made him particularly dangerous to someone attempting deception. "Inspector," she said during a brief lull in the proceedings, "I wonder if we might examine those contact prints that were rescued from the darkroom. Sometimes photographs reveal details that escape casual observation." The prints, still damp from their interrupted processing, showed the exhibition in remarkable detail. One image in particular caught Miss Marple's attention, a photograph taken during the actinic lamp demonstration that captured not only the necklace under the blue light but also the hands and wrists of those gathered around the display case. In that frozen moment, preserved forever by Mr. Luier's skilled photography, lay evidence that would prove crucial to understanding the true sequence of events that had led to both theft and murder. Chapter 8. The Darkroom Door and the Ribbon in Black. The afternoon. Sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when Miss Marple requested permission to examine the darkroom more thoroughly. Inspector Slack, recognizing the value of her observational skills despite his initial skepticism, granted access to what had now become a crucial crime scene. The small room retained the acrid smell of photographic chemicals mixed with something more sinister, the lingering presence of violence that seemed to permeate the cramped space. Miss Marple moved carefully among the equipment, her trained eyes searching for details that might have escaped earlier notice. Her first significant discovery involved the key that had been found inside the locked room. Using Inspector Slack's magnifying glass, she examined the brass surface, with the sort of methodical attention that had served her well in countless previous investigations. "Inspector," she said quietly, "observe the traces on this key. There are minute particles of grease pencil residue near the top, mixed with coal dust from the stove. But the pattern suggests these materials came from outside the room, not from normal use within it. Inspector Slack studied the evidence with growing interest. "You're suggesting the key was manipulated from outside?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "Someone used a thin implement, probably a blade of some sort, to turn the key from the hallway side, then pushed it back under the door to create the impression that Mr. Luyer had locked himself in. This discovery fundamentally altered the nature of the crime scene, confirming that the young photographer had been murdered by someone else who had then arranged the scene to suggest suicide or accident." Miss Marple's second discovery proved equally significant. The black velvet ribbon that had been used as the murder weapon lay coiled on the table where Inspector Slack had placed it after the initial examination. Using a pair of photographic tweezers, she lifted it carefully to the light, studying its surface with minute attention. Embedded in the velvet pile, barely visible even under magnification, was a short fiber of white cotton bearing the distinctive salvage edge that marked high-quality textile manufacturing. The fiber was so fine as to be nearly transparent, yet its presence provided crucial evidence about the murderer's identity. "This cotton fiber," Miss Marple observed, "appears to be of the type used in the finest glove linings. Notice the salvage edge, which indicates material woven specifically for luxury goods rather than common use." Lady Estelle, who had been observing the proceedings with apparent fascination, stepped forward slightly. "How remarkable that you can determine so much from such a tiny piece of evidence, Miss Marple." Miss Marple glanced up with a gentle smile. "In my experience, Lady Estelle, the smallest details often prove the most revealing. Might I ask, have you had occasion to repair your gloves recently? I noticed earlier that the thumb area shows signs of expert mending." The question hung in the air with deceptive casualness, yet its implications were clear to everyone present. Lady Estelle's composure remained intact, though Miss Marple detected a slight tightening around her eyes. "One learns to maintain fine things properly," Lady Estelle replied with admirable sang-froid, "though I hardly see how my needlework relates to this tragic affair." Miss Marple's third discovery involved Mr. Pritchard's lamp case, which had been found hanging on the darkroom wall despite his insistence that he had left it in the exhibition room. She examined the felt lining with particular care, noting several details that would prove significant. Within the soft material, she found a minute sliver of glass bearing traces of varnish, the sort of fragment that might be produced when a screwdriver slipped while removing a corner screw from a display case. The glass was so small as to be nearly invisible, yet its composition matched perfectly with the reinforced panes of the exhibition cases. "Most illuminating," she murmured, carefully preserving the fragment in one of Inspector Slack's evidence envelopes. This suggests that Mr. Pritchard's case was present during the actual substitution, not merely abandoned hereafter. As the examination continued, Miss Marple began to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to Mr. Luyer's death. The evidence suggested that the young photographer had discovered something about the necklace substitution, probably through his detailed photographic work that had made him dangerous to the real perpetrator. "The question," she said to Inspector Slack, "is whether Mr. Luyer was attempting blackmail or simply seeking clarification about what he had observed." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. "We found what appears to be an unfinished letter in his equipment case. The salutation reads, 'Dear Lady Estelle,' though the body of the message was never completed." This revelation added another layer to the complex web of relationships and motivations that had culminated in murder. If Mr. Luyer had been preparing to contact Lady Estelle about his discoveries, it suggested that his photographs had captured something compromising about her involvement in the evening's events. Miss Marple requested to see the contact sheets that had been rescued from the developer tray, studying them with the sort of attention she might have devoted to a particularly complex knitting pattern. One image in particular held her interest. A photograph taken during the actinic lamp demonstration that showed not only the necklace under the blue light but also the positioning of various hands around the display case. "How very interesting," she observed, indicating a particular section of the photograph with her finger. "This image appears to show a gloved hand in a position that would be consistent with someone manipulating the case contents during the demonstration." Inspector Slack examined the photograph carefully. "The angle makes it difficult to determine whose hand it is, but the glove appears to be white kid leather of exceptional quality." Lady Estelle maintained her composure admirably, though Miss Marple noticed that her gloved hands remained perfectly still at her sides, an unusual degree of control that often indicated conscious effort rather than natural ease. As the afternoon progressed, and the various pieces of evidence began to form a coherent picture, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain about the identity of both the thief and the murderer. Yet she also recognized that proving her theories would require more than the accumulation of physical evidence. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we need to understand not just how these crimes were committed, but why they were necessary. The theft itself seems almost secondary to the larger purpose behind it." The gathering dusk outside the dark-room windows seemed to echo the shadows that had fallen across what had begun as a simple charity exhibition. In the space of 2 days, the Gossington sapphires had been stolen, a young man had been murdered, and the peaceful routine of village life had been shattered by forces that had been set in motion weeks before the exhibition had even been announced. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and regarded the assembled group with the sort of gentle attention that had served her so well over the years. In her experience, the moment of revelation often came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of truth that made deception impossible to maintain. "I believe," she said quietly, "that we are now ready to understand exactly what happened here, and why it was necessary for someone to commit murder to protect their secret." Chapter 9. Insurance Keys and a Jeweler's Hand. The library at Gossington Hall had taken on the atmosphere of an informal courtroom, as Inspector Slack methodically reviewed the evidence that had accumulated throughout the day. Miss Marple occupied her corner chair, her knitting needles clicking softly in the gathering dusk, while the various suspects maintained their positions with a sort of careful composure that often preceded dramatic revelations. Mr. Warborough, prompted by Inspector Slack's direct questioning, provided additional details about the insurance arrangements that cast the entire affair in a new light. "The policy increase was arranged at Mr. Pritchard's specific recommendation," he admitted, reluctantly. "He provided the updated valuation and insisted that the additional coverage take effect immediately. I must confess at the time it seemed merely prudent, given the public nature of the exhibition." Inspector Slack made careful notes while Miss Marple observed the reactions of those present. Mr. Pritchard's professional composure remained intact, though she detected subtle signs of tension in the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. "The show." "Timing was indeed fortunate," Inspector Slack observed with deliberate neutrality. "If the theft had occurred before the policy increase, the financial loss would have been considerably greater." Lady Estelle contributed her own perspective with characteristic elegance. "Surely such precautions are standard practice in the jewelry trade. One would hardly expect Mr. Pritchard to advise inadequate coverage for pieces of such historical significance." Miss Marple found this defense of Mr. Pritchard particularly interesting, especially coming from someone who had earlier been quick to characterize the crime as the work of an impulsive artist. Such shifts in emphasis often revealed more about the speaker's own concerns than about the situation being discussed. Inspector Slack turned his attention to the physical evidence that had been accumulating throughout the investigation. We still need to account for how Mr. Pritchard's lamp case came to be in the dark room when he insists he left it in the exhibition room. I have absolutely no explanation for that, Mr. Pritchard declared with apparent sincerity. After the demonstration yesterday evening, I distinctly remember placing the case on the table near the display. I cannot imagine how it came to be moved. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with a sort of gentle attention that had so often preceded her most penetrating observations. Mr. Pritchard, would you mind demonstrating once again how you secure equipment for transport? I noticed yesterday that you use a particular type of knot. The request seemed harmless enough, and Mr. Pritchard readily accepted a length of cord from Inspector Slack's supplies. His fingers moved with automatic precision, creating the tight, flat jeweler's half-hitch that Miss Marple had observed earlier. Fascinating, she murmured, studying the completed knot carefully. Such techniques require years of practice to execute properly. The bite is extraordinarily secure. Exactly the sort of fastening one would use for valuable items during transport. Inspector Slack examined the knot with professional interest before making his next revelation. We found an identical knot securing the actinic lamp cord to a table leg near the display case. The positioning would have been perfect for someone working inside the case during the power failure. The implications of this discovery settled over the group with uncomfortable weight. If Mr. Pritchard's distinctive knotting technique had been used to secure equipment during the theft, it suggested his direct involvement despite his protestations of innocence. Coincidence? Surely, Lady Estelle interjected quickly. Many people in trades requiring secure fastenings might use similar techniques. Miss Marple's response was delivered with characteristic mildness. Perhaps, though the jeweler's half-hitch is quite specialized. Lady Estelle, might I ask about your own experience with such technical matters? The question seemed to catch Lady Estelle off guard, though she recovered her composure admirably. I'm afraid my knowledge of such things is quite limited, Miss Marple. One relies upon experts for technical advice. Inspector Slack produced the crucial contact sheet that had been rescued from the darkroom's developer tray. The photograph, still damp from its interrupted processing, showed the actinic lamp demonstration in remarkable detail. This image, he announced, captured something rather significant that was missed during the confusion of the demonstration itself. He held the photograph up to the light, indicating specific areas with his pencil. The blue radiance of the actinic lamp had created unusual shadows and highlights that revealed details invisible under normal illumination. Here, Inspector Slack continued, we can see a hand reaching inside the display case, rather than hovering above it as one might expect during a normal demonstration. The positioning suggests someone was manipulating the contents rather than simply displaying them. Miss Marple studied the photograph with considerable interest. The angle also captures something else of significance. A gloved wrist steadying the lamp while the manipulation took place. The glove appears to be white kid leather, extending well past the wrist. Lady Estelle's composure finally showed signs of strain. Surely such details are too unclear to draw definitive conclusions. Photography can be quite deceptive under unusual lighting conditions. Indeed it can, Miss Marple agreed gently. Though Mr. Luyar was quite skilled at his craft. He would have known how to account for such variables. The mention of the murdered photographer cast a somber mood over the proceedings. Inspector Slack consulted his notes before making his next observation. We found evidence that Mr. Luyar had been attempting to contact someone on the evening of his death, an unfinished letter, as I mentioned, addressed to Lady Estelle. This revelation prompted an immediate response from the lady in question. Received no communication from Mr. Luyar. I can assure you, whatever he may have intended to write, it never reached me." Miss Marple's next question seemed almost casual in its delivery, yet its implications were anything but innocent. "Lady Estelle, I couldn't help noticing that your gloves show signs of recent repair. The mending is quite expertly done. One would hardly notice unless examining closely." Lady Estelle glanced down at her gloves with apparent surprise. "As I mentioned before, one learns to maintain fine things properly. Though I hardly see the relevance." "The relevance," Inspector Slack interrupted, "lies in the white cotton fiber we found on the ribbon used to strangle Mr. Luyer, a fiber that matches the type used in luxury glove linings." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent picture, though the complete solution still required careful explanation. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and regarded the assembled group with the sort of gentle authority that had served her well throughout her long career as an observer of human nature. "I believe," she said quietly, "that we are now ready to understand exactly how these crimes were planned and executed. The evidence points to a collaboration between two individuals, each with specific skills and opportunities, who worked together to steal the necklace, but found themselves at cross purposes when complications arose. The evening shadows had deepened around Gossington Hall as Miss Marple prepared to reveal the truth that lay beneath the surface of what had appeared to be a simple charity exhibition gone wrong. Chapter 10. Evening Song and the Necklace Uncursed. The library at Albamsebar. Gossington Hall had grown quiet, save the gentle ticking of the mantel clock, as Miss Marple prepared to weave together the various threads of evidence into a coherent explanation. The evening light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the assembled group, creating an atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the revelation of truth. "Before we proceed," Inspector Slack announced formally, "I should like to clarify the precise charges we are considering. We have the theft of the Gossington sapphires and the murder of Mr. Gavin Luyer. The evidence suggests these crimes are connected, though perhaps not in the manner we initially supposed." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Indeed, Inspector, the connection lies not in a single perpetrator, but in the intersection of two separate schemes that became fatally entangled." She rose from her chair and moved to the center of the room, where she could address each person directly. Her manner remained gentle, yet there was an authority in her bearing that commanded attention. "Let us begin with the anonymous warning notes," she said, producing the typed messages from her handbag. The eye. Evidence of the chipped E pointed to Mr. Luyer as their author. However, I believe these were indeed his work, not as part of a theft scheme, but as genuine attempts to create publicity for the exhibition. His enthusiasm for the project was authentic, and such dramatic touches would have appealed to his artistic temperament. Mrs. Bantry shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But if Gavin wrote the warnings, why would he then steal the very necklace he was trying to protect? "He wouldn't," Miss Marple replied simply. "And he didn't. The theft was conceived and executed by someone else entirely, someone who used Mr. Luyer's innocent publicity efforts as convenient cover for their own criminal purpose." She turned her attention to the physical evidence that had accumulated throughout the investigation. The substitution itself was a masterwork of preparation and timing. The velvet cradle with its two distinct impressions tells us that both the original necklace and its paste replica had been placed there at different times, evidence of careful advanced planning. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The paste copies would have required weeks to prepare properly, according to Mr. Pritchard's professional assessment. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "Which brings us to the first perpetrator, Mr. Basil Pritchard himself." The accusation fell into the quiet room like a stone into still water. Mr. Pritchard's professional composure finally cracked entirely, his face showing a mixture of defiance and resignation. The evidence against Mr. Pritchard is quite substantial. Miss Marple continued methodically. The velvet cradle was his creation, designed with two impressions to accommodate both the original and the replica. The diagonal pattern of disturbed screws on the display case, the glass fragment with varnish found in his lamp case, and most significantly, his distinctive jeweler's half-hitch used to secure the actinic lamp during the theft. She paused to allow the implications to settle before continuing. The actinic lamp demonstration was not merely a display of the necklace's authenticity. It was cover for the substitution itself. During those crucial minutes of dimmed lighting, Mr. Pritchard was able to exchange the pieces while appearing to conduct a legitimate evaluation. Mr. Pritchard's shoulders sagged as the weight of evidence mounted against him. The insurance valuation I provided was entirely accurate. I increased the coverage because I knew the risk of theft was imminent, though I intended to recover the original necklace later and claim it had been found. A remarkably sophisticated plan, Miss Marple observed. You would ship the real necklace away in the false bottom of your lamp case, later discover the substitution, collect the insurance settlement, and eventually recover the original for resale through other channels. The curse warnings provided by Mr. Luyer gave you the perfect atmosphere of supernatural threat to mask. A very practical crime. Inspector Slack made careful notes as the confession unfolded. But something went wrong with your plan, didn't it, Mr. Pritchard? Luyer's photographs, Mr. Pritchard admitted reluctantly. His camera captured details that I hadn't anticipated. The missing chip in the central stone, the positioning of hands during the demonstration. He realized a substitution had occurred and began asking questions. Miss Marple's expression grew more somber as she addressed the murder that had transformed theft into tragedy. This brings us to the second perpetrator, the person who killed Mr. Luyer to prevent him from exposing the substitution. All eyes turned to Lady Estelle, whose elegant composure had gradually given way to something approaching desperation. The white kid gloves that had seemed merely fashionable accessories now appeared as evidence of guilt. The photographic evidence was damning, Miss Marple continued gently. Mr. Luyer's contact print showed your gloved wrist steadying the actinic lamp, while Mr. Pritchard worked inside the display case. You were his accomplice in the theft, providing the additional pair of hands necessary for such a delicate operation. Lady Estelle's voice, when she finally spoke, had lost all its cultured assurance. It was never supposed to involve murder. When Gavin summoned me to the dark room, claiming he had evidence that would ruin me, I only meant to silence him temporarily. But the ribbon tightened more than you intended, Miss Marple observed sadly. The white cotton fiber from your glove lining, found embedded in the velvet ribbon, confirms your presence at the murder scene. The tiny tear in your glove, so expertly mended, marks the moment when the fiber was caught and pulled free during the struggle. Inspector Slack rose from his chair with official gravity. Lady Estelle March, Basil Pritchard, I am placing you both under arrest for the theft of the Gossington sapphires and the murder of Gavin Luyer. As the arrest proceeded, with formal efficiency, Miss Marple turned to one final detail that had troubled her throughout the investigation. Inspector, I believe you'll find the original necklace in the false bottom of Mr. Pritchard's lamp case. The mechanism is quite ingenious, a hidden latch that creates a perfect hiding place for valuables. Inspector Slack pried open the concealed compartment to reveal the genuine Gossington sapphires, their deep blue stones catching the lamplight with the unmistakable fire of authentic gems. The safety chain lay arranged in Mrs. Bantry's familiar left-facing pattern, and the central stone bore the tiny chip at 3 hours that had marked it for generations. Mrs. Bantry accepted the recovered necklace with trembling hands, her relief evident despite the tragic circumstances of its return. "To think that all this began with a simple charity exhibition," she murmured. "How could such evil have hidden behind such ordinary appearances?" Miss Marple settled back into her corner chair as the formalities of arrest and evidence collection continued around her. "In my experience, Dolly, the most dangerous crimes often wear the most respectable faces. Mr. Pritchard's professional reputation provided perfect cover for his theft, while Lady Estelle's social standing made her seem above suspicion." As the evening drew toward its conclusion, and the various participants departed for their respective destinations, some to freedom, others to custody, Miss Marple reflected on the human elements that had transformed a simple theft into tragedy. "The real curse of the Gossington sapphires," she observed to Mrs. Bantry as they prepared to leave the library, "was not supernatural but entirely human. It lay in the greed that transformed professionals into criminals and drove them to murder when their scheme was threatened." Mrs. Bantry fastened the recovered necklace around her throat with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. "I think I shall donate the sapphires to a museum, Jane. They've brought quite enough excitement to St. Mary Mead." "A wise decision," Miss Marple agreed gently. "After all, curses are only habits with stories told about them. And habits, how one ties a knot or which way one fastens a clasp, are often the most truthful things in the world." The bells of St. Mary Mead were ringing for evensong as they walked together through the gathering dusk. The mystery solved, and the necklace finally free of both its legendary curse and the very real evil that had surrounded it.